A girl whom the world calls trash stands before a man who owns the city, holding his greatest treasure over a sink as his guards draw their weapons. The air in the private hospital kitchen is thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of despair. Lorenzo Moretti, a man whose name makes grown men tremble, is on his knees, his face buried in his hands. The doctors the best money can buy have already turned away, their faces masks of professional pity. "Time of death," they said. Into this silence steps Gloria, dirty, wearing a faded blue shirt and smelling of the rain outside. She doesn't see the power or the guns. She only sees a baby whose soul is halfway out the door. The contrast is stark. The sterile, high-tech world of the elite has failed, and now the survival instincts of the streets are the only thing left. The silence in the room was heavier than the grief itself, a cold, clinical weight that pressed the air from everyone's lungs. On the monitor, the rhythmic dancing of the green lines suddenly smoothed into a terrifying, infinite horizon. The high-pitched, steady drone of the flatline filled the space, signaling the end of a life that had barely begun. Lorenzo Moretti, a man who had built an empire on iron and blood, collapsed. His scream was not the roar of a titan, but the jagged, guttural sound of a man being hollowed out from the inside. It was a noise that froze the marrow in the doctor's bones, a sound that bypassed the brain and struck straight at the primal fear of every soul present. The medical team stepped back, their hands hanging limp at their sides, their faces masks of professional defeat. They had used every drug, every shock, every piece of technology money could buy, and they had failed. To them, the story was over. The room was now a tomb. But Gloria didn't see a tomb. She moved from the shadows near the stainless steel industrial sink, her faded blue shirt a sharp contrast to the sterile white coats. She didn't look at the grieving father or the armed men standing guard. She looked only at the infant, Leo, whose skin was beginning to take on the gray hue of a cooling hearth. While the world's finest experts were already checking their watches to record the time of death, Gloria felt a pull, a desperate, whispering instinct that had kept her alive under bridges and in frozen alleys. She reached out, her small, calloused hands sliding beneath the baby's fragile weight. The machines continued their mournful whistle, but Gloria's focus was a laser. She snatched the child from the tangle of wires and plastic, defying the laws of the hospital and the will of the most dangerous man in the city. As she turned toward the faucet, she wasn't a homeless girl anymore. She was the only bridge left between this side and the next. Gloria moved through the city like a draft of cold air, unseen, uncounted, and utterly alone. To the thousands of people who crossed the bridge every morning, she was nothing more than a smudge of blue against the gray concrete, a shadow that disappeared when the sun went down. She lived in the hollows of the iron pylons, where the constant vibration of the traffic above felt like a heartbeat she didn't have to provide for herself. Her world was measured in the rhythmic clanking of tires on metal and the damp, metallic scent of the river that never stopped moving. Under the bridge, survival was a study in silence. Gloria had learned that to be noticed was to be endangered, so she became a master of the periphery. She survived by finding the gaps in the world, the half-eaten sandwich left on a park bench, the discarded blanket snagged on a pier, the quiet moments when the hospital janitors left the basement door propped open. But her greatest tool wasn't her ability to hide, it was her ability to see. She spent hours perched on a rusted crate, watching the parade of humanity. She didn't look at their clothes or their shoes, she looked at their eyes. It was a lesson her mother had whispered to her long before the fire. The eyes tell you if the soul is home. Gloria categorized every person who crossed her path. There were the empty eyes, the most common kind, those who looked through her as if she were a pane of glass, their minds already at their desks or in their debts. They were safe because they were blind. Then there were the full eyes. Some were full of a sharp, jagged hunger that made her pull her knees to her chest. Others were full of a soft, aching pity that felt heavier than the hunger. She learned that the full eyes were the ones to fear and the ones to follow. A man with eyes full of rage would strike if she stood too close. A woman with eyes full of sorrow might drop a coin she didn't realize she'd lost. Gloria became a connoisseur of human intent, a small, observant ghost who knew the internal weather of strangers before they even spoke. She lived on the scraps of their lives, a girl who didn't exist in any registry, yet knew the city better than those who owned it. She was waiting for something, though she didn't know what, until the day the rain drove her toward the hospital doors, and she saw a man whose eyes were becoming the emptiest she had ever seen. The sterile silence of the ward didn't break, it shattered. Gloria didn't look like a woman in the throes of a life-altering crisis. She looked like a force of nature reclaiming its territory. She moved toward the industrial sink with a terrifying, singular focus, her fingers curling around the cold chrome of the faucet. Behind her, the heavy double doors burst open, the vacuum of the hallway pulling in the frantic energy of men who were used to being in control, and suddenly found themselves chasing a ghost. "Stop her! Get her away from the instruments!" the lead doctor screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched panic that stripped him of his professional veneer. He didn't understand the physics of what was happening, how a woman who had been a patient moments ago now moved with the precision of an assassin. The guards were a half-step behind, their leather holsters creaking as they reached for weapons they hadn't yet been cleared to fire. They saw the threat not in a blade or a gun, but in the sheer defiance radiating off her. "Down on the floor, now!" one shouted, his hand hovering over the grip of his sidearm, but his boots skidded on the linoleum, a fraction of a second too slow. Gloria didn't flinch. She twisted the handle. The water didn't just flow. It roared, a silver torrent hitting the basin that sounded, in that cramped space, like a cleansing flood. It was the faucet of life, the only honest thing in a room built on lies and cold steel. As the guards closed the distance, their hands reaching to wrench her arms back, the world narrowed down to a single point of biological truth. The chaos of the shouting men and the scuffle of boots faded into a muffled hum, drowned out by a sound that silenced the entire room. It was a sharp, jagged intake of breath, followed by a sound that was both fragile and demanding. The first cry. It was a gasping, wet rattle that smoothed into a piercing wail, echoing off the tiled walls and freezing the guards mid-stride. The Mafia's heir, the boy they had already mapped out a bloody future for, announced his arrival not with a coronation, but with a scream for oxygen. In that moment, the power dynamic of the room inverted. The men with the guns and the degrees were suddenly spectators to a miracle they couldn't arrest and a life they couldn't yet claim. Gloria stood over the sink, the water still running, her eyes locked on the small, poolsing life that had just turned their violent world upside down. Lorenzo stood behind the reinforced glass, his reflection ghosting over the sight of the infant in the incubator. For all his empires, his shipping lanes, and the small army of men who jumped at the twitch of his finger, he had been powerless against the silence of a child who refused to breathe. His millions had bought the finest ventilators and the most prestigious surgeon's money could bribe, yet it was the girl from the gutter, the one with the dirt beneath her fingernails and the feral light in her eyes, who had reached into the void and pulled his legacy back into the light. The debt was heavy, a weight more profound than any ledger he had ever balanced. He watched Gloria through the doorway, her frame slumped with exhaustion but her gaze still sharp, still guarded. She had done what God and science had seemingly abandoned. He didn't turn around when his underboss approached, the man's footsteps heavy with the expectation of an order to dispose of the witness. Lorenzo simply raised a hand, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried the finality of a death sentence and a gospel combined. "She is not a stray anymore," he murmured, the coldness of his gaze finally breaking into something resembling awe. "From this second, Gloria is under my shadow. If a hair on her head is ruffled, if she so much as feels a chill she does not desire, the person responsible will cease to exist. She is untouchable." The decree moved through the hospital like a shockwave, rippling out to the guards in the hall and the associates waiting in the blacked-out SUVs below. The transition was seamless and terrifyingly swift. There was no paperwork, no questions asked. Gloria was lifted from the hard plastic chair of the ward, not by force, but with a deference that bordered on religious fear. The rough denim and stained cotton she wore were stripped away, replaced by the weight of heavy emerald silk that felt like a second skin. She was moved from the flickering fluorescent hum of the street-side clinic to the penthouse suite of the family's private wing. Here, the air smelled of sandalwood and expensive stillness. When she sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress didn't creak. It yielded, the silk sheets cool and impossibly smooth against her skin. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had just wrestled a life from the drain of a sink, and saw them resting against fabric that cost more than the tenement she had grown up in. She was no longer a ghost in the machinery of the city. She was the most valuable asset in the syndicate, a queen made of grit and miracles, trapped in a cage of gold. Lorenzo stood behind the reinforced glass, his reflection ghosting over the site of the infant in the incubator. For all his empires, his shipping lanes, and the small army of men who jumped at the twitch of his finger, he had been powerless against the silence of a child who refused to breathe. His millions had bought the finest ventilators and the most prestigious surgeons money could bribe, yet it was the girl from the gutter, the one with the dirt beneath her fingernails and the feral light in her eyes, who had reached into the void and pulled his legacy back into the light. The debt was heavy, a weight more profound than any ledger he had ever balanced. He watched Gloria through the doorway, her frame slumped with exhaustion but her gaze still sharp, still guarded. She had done what God and science had seemingly abandoned. He didn't turn around when his underboss approached, the man's footsteps heavy with the expectation of an order to dispose of the witness. Lorenzo simply raised a hand, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried the finality of a death sentence and a gospel combined. "She is not a stray anymore," he murmured, the coldness of his gaze finally breaking into something resembling awe. "From this second, Gloria is under my shadow. If a hair on her head is ruffled, if she so much as feels a chill she does not desire, the person responsible will cease to exist. She is untouchable." The decree moved through the hospital like a shockwave, rippling out to the guards in the hall and the associates waiting in the blacked-out SUVs below. The transition was seamless and terrifyingly swift. There was no paperwork, no questions asked. Gloria was lifted from the hard plastic chair of the ward, not by force, but with a deference that bordered on religious fear. The rough denim and stained cotton she wore were stripped away, replaced by the weight of heavy emerald silk that felt like a second skin. She was moved from the flickering fluorescent hum of the street-side clinic to the penthouse suite of the family's private wing. Here, the air smelled of sandalwood and expensive stillness. When she sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress didn't creak. It yielded, the silk sheets cool and impossibly smooth against her skin. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had just wrestled a life from the drain of a sink, and saw them resting against fabric that cost more than the tenement she had grown up in. She was no longer a ghost in the machinery of the city. She was the most valuable asset in the syndicate, a queen made of grit and miracles, trapped in a cage of gold. The mansion was a monument to silence, but it was a brittle, artificial thing. In the nursery, where the wallpaper was hand-painted silk and the air was filtered to a clinical purity, the silence was frequently torn apart by a sound that no amount of Lorenzo's money could suppress. Leo, the heir to a kingdom built on iron and blood, refused the comfort of his high-tech cradle. He wailed with a primal, jagged intensity that sent the specialized nurses scurrying for sedatives and leather-bound manuals. They offered him warmth, calibrated formula, and the rhythmic rocking of automated chairs, but the boy screamed until his face turned a bruised purple, his tiny fists swinging at a world he clearly found unrecognizable. The screaming only stopped when Gloria crossed the threshold. She didn't approach with the clinical softness of the staff. She moved with the heavy, grounded step of someone who knew the weight of the earth. As she sat by the crib, the boy's frantic gasps smoothed into a rhythmic, pulsing quiet. He didn't just stop crying. He anchored himself to her presence. His small, clouded eyes would lock onto hers, finding the only familiar frequency in a sea of static. Gloria realized then that she wasn't just the girl who had pulled him from the sink. She was the only bridge he had to the living. To Leo, the doctors were ghosts and the nurses were machines, but Gloria was the heat of the sun. She began to sit with him for hours, ignoring the cameras tucked into the ornate molding. She didn't sing lullabies. Those were for children who expected peace. Instead, she taught him the silent language of the survivor. She would take his microscopic hand and press it against the cold glass of the window, letting him feel the vibration of the city hum far below. "That's the beast," she would whisper, her voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in his bones. "It's hungry, Leo. You have to hear it coming before it sees you." She showed him how to track the movement of shadows across the ceiling, teaching him to find the exits in a room before he could even crawl toward them. She guided his fingers over the rough grain of a hidden wooden joint or the sharp edge of a silver rattle, bypassed the soft toys for things with weight and consequence. She was raising him to see the world not as a playground, but as a map of pressures and pivots. He was the Mafia's prince, but under Gloria's tutelage, he was becoming something much more dangerous, a boy who knew how to breathe underwater. As Leo finally drifted into a deep, untroubled sleep, his fingers remained hooked firmly into the hem of her silk sleeve, a silent vow that neither of them would ever truly be alone in the dark again. The silk hadn't just been a cage, it had been a sensory deprivation chamber that nearly made her soft. But when the window in the nursery didn't shatter, when it simply dissolved into 1,000 silent, crystalline diamonds under the pressure of a professional-grade glass cutter, the street-bred animal inside Gloria woke up screaming. The men who came through the frame weren't Lorenzo. They moved with a jagged, hungry efficiency that smelled of a different kind of blood. They didn't want the child for a ransom. They wanted the leverage of the untouchable girl. To the rival families, Gloria wasn't a miracle. She was the boss's jugular. They moved with the practiced silence of ghosts, but Gloria had spent a lifetime listening for the creak of a floorboard before a landlord's fist hit the door. She didn't scream. Screaming was for those who expected help. Instead, she rolled off the bed, her hand dipping instinctively into the pillowcase where the stale, hardened crusts of bread were hidden alongside a heavy, silver-plated hairbrush she'd sharpened against the stone windowsill for weeks. As the first shadow reached for Leo's crib, Gloria didn't retreat. She became the shadow. The transit to the extraction point was a blur of cold air and the hum of a high-performance engine, but Gloria remained terrifyingly still in the back of the van, her body curled like a shield around the infant. She felt the vibrations of the road, counting the turns, mapping the potholes she remembered from the industrial district where the city's bones were exposed. When the van slowed for the rusted iron gates of a derelict slaughterhouse, she knew the geography better than her captors did. They saw a ruin. She saw a labyrinth of rusted pipes and blind corners. As the doors slid open, she didn't wait for a command. She used the weight of the silver brush, driven by a desperate maternal fury, to find the soft space behind her captor's knee. As he buckled, she vanished into the gloom of the warehouse. Leo pressed so tightly to her chest he could feel her heart drumming a war march. She didn't run for the bright, open exits where the gunmen waited. She climbed. She found the narrow, grease-slicked catwalks that the pampered guards were too heavy to navigate. In the rafters, suspended over the men shouting her name, she looked down at Leo. The boy didn't cry. He watched her with those wide, ancient eyes, his tiny hand gripping her collar just as she had taught him. She showed him how to melt into the dark, how to breathe through the nose to stay silent, and how to use the high, whistling wind of the warehouse to mask their movement. She was no longer a specimen or a guest. She was the ghost of the slums, and she was bringing the Mafia's air home through the attic of hell. The air in the slaughterhouse didn't just grow cold. It curdled. Outside, the sky over the industrial district bruised into a sickly, electric purple, and then the first crack of thunder tore through the corrugated metal roof like a physical blow. To the men hunting them below, it was merely weather, a tactical complication in a botched kidnapping. To Gloria, crouched on a rusted catwalk with Leo pressed to her heart, the sound was a key turning in a lock she had spent years trying to weld shut. The scent of the rain hitting the hot, oily machinery rose up in a humid cloud, but Gloria's nostrils flared as they found a different ghost. She didn't smell the damp city. She smelled the acrid, chemical bite of burning polyurethane and the heavy, sweet rot of charred timber. The flickering strobe of lightning against the high windows wasn't a storm. It was the strobe of the flames that had licked the ceiling of the tenement while she was still a girl, the day the world had turned to ash and she had learned how to breathe through a wet rag. Her grip on Leo didn't loosen, but it became rigid, a rigor mortis of the living. The boy felt the change instantly. The anchor he had relied on, the woman who was the sun, suddenly went cold and dark. He let out a small, questioning whimper, but Gloria didn't hear him. She was no longer in the rafters of a warehouse. She was back in the hallway of a crumbling fourth-floor walk-up, the floorboards screaming beneath her feet and the smoke blooming like a black rose in the lungs of everyone she loved. The smoke of her past didn't just cloud her vision. It settled into her joints, turning her blood to lead. She slumped against a rusted support beam, her eyes wide and fixed on a point miles and years away. The shouting of the rival gunmen echoed through the chamber, their boots clanging on the iron stairs, but to Gloria, those sounds were the crackling of support beams and the distant, useless sirens of a fire department that would arrive too late. She collapsed into a catatonic heap, her cheek pressed against the cold, greasy metal. She was a statue of emerald silk and terror, lost in a memory so bright and hot it burned away the present. Leo, sensing the void where her strength used to be, went deathly silent, his tiny fingers tangled in her hair as they both waited for the fire to finish what it had started a lifetime ago. The storm raged outside, but inside Gloria, the silence was absolute. The smoke in her mind was thick, a cloying charcoal veil that tasted of old grief and melted plastic. Gloria was a passenger in her own body, watching the rafters of the slaughterhouse dissolve into the jagged, orange ribs of a burning tenement. She couldn't feel the cold iron beneath her or the damp pull of the storm. She only felt the heat that had once taken everything. She was a ghost trapped in a loop of cinders, waiting for the ceiling to finally cave in. Then a small, firm hand pressed against her cheek. It wasn't the searing touch of a flame, but something grounding and cool. "Look at me, Gloria." The voice was young, yet it carried an eerie, inherited authority that cut through the roar of the remembered fire. Leo stood before her, no longer the helpless infant she had pulled from the sink, but a 5-year-old prince of the underworld with eyes that had seen too much too soon. He didn't shrink from her catatonic stare. He didn't call for the guards who hovered anxiously at the edge of the room. He simply reached out and took her hand, his small fingers interlacing with her trembling ones, pulling her up from the abyss. He led her toward the back of the nursery suite, his steps deliberate and heavy. The mansion was silent, the storm outside fading into a rhythmic drumming against the glass. When they reached the marble basin of the bathroom, the light reflecting off the chrome was a sharp, clinical white. Leo reached up, his movements mimicking the muscle memory he had inherited from her, and twisted the handle. The water didn't roar like a flood this time, it sang. It was a clear, silver ribbon that broke the spell of the ash. Leo cupped his hands, gathering the cold liquid, and splashed it directly onto Gloria's face. The shock of it was a baptism. The smell of burning timber vanished, replaced by the scent of ozone and expensive soap. He did it again, his gaze locked onto hers with a terrifying, singular focus. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that settled in her marrow, echoing the very lessons she had whispered into his ear when he was nothing but a gasping miracle. He reached up, wiping a stray droplet from her eyelash with his thumb. "The fire is gone, Gloria," I put it out. She blinked, the world snapping back into a sharp, painful focus. The emerald silk of her sleeves was damp, and the boy standing before her was no longer a debt to be paid or a specimen to be guarded. He was her anchor. The heir to a bloody empire had become the only person capable of navigating the wreckage of her soul. As the last of the smoke cleared from her vision, Gloria took a long, jagged breath, the air finally tasting like the present. The emerald silk had long since been traded for a sturdy, charcoal wool that didn't catch on the jagged edges of the world. Gloria walked through the heavy iron gates of the mansion, not as a prisoner or a ghost, but as a woman who had finally learned to carry her own weight. She didn't look back at the gilded cage where she had been polished into a specimen. Her eyes were fixed on the bruised horizon of the city, where the smoke was real, and the fires were still burning in the hearts of those the world had forgotten. She had established her sanctuary in a converted warehouse on the edge of the district, where the sirens never truly stopped. It wasn't a clinic with sterile white walls or cold, leather-bound clipboards. It was a space of brick and soft light, filled with the low hum of a refrigerator and the steady, rhythmic drip of a sink that never quite stayed shut. She called them the invisible children, the ones who moved through the system like shadows, their lungs full of the soot of neglect and their eyes wide with the hypervigilance of the hunted. Gloria didn't sit behind a desk. She sat on the floor, her back against the cool plaster, waiting for them to emerge from the corners of their own silence. She knew the language of the twitching hand and the hollowed-out stare. When a young girl arrived with skin like parchment and a voice that had rusted from disuse, Gloria didn't offer a diagnosis. She didn't call for the specialists who had once circled her like vultures. Instead, she led the child to the basin in the corner. She let the water run until it was a clear, silver ribbon, the sound filling the room like a quiet prayer. She watched as the girl's reflection wavered in the porcelain, a fractured image of a soul trying to find its way home. Gloria reached out, her fingers no longer trembling, and dipped them into the flow. "It's just water," she whispered, her voice a low vibration that grounded the room. "It's not the fire, it's the thing that puts it out." She moved through the city's wreckage as a healer who understood that medicine was often found in the mundane. She taught them how to breathe when the air felt like lead, and how to find the exits in a room without losing their dignity. She was a living testament to the fact that a miracle wasn't a biological anomaly to be mapped. It was a choice made in the dark. Years later, a black sedan would occasionally idle at the curb outside her center, the tinted windows shielding a young man with eyes that held the history of a dynasty. Leo never came inside. He knew his world was a different kind of fire, but he watched her from the shadows. He saw her kneeling by a sink with a terrified boy, splashing cool water onto a forehead lined with premature grief. Gloria would catch his gaze through the glass, a silent acknowledgement between the anchor and the ship. She had left the mansion to work among the ashes, knowing that sometimes a little water and a lot of faith were the only tools required to pull a soul back from the drain.